It began not with sirens or headlines, but with whispers that felt out of place in a world built on routine and polish. Morning television thrives on predictability, on smiles that arrive on cue, and laughter that feels effortless. But behind the scenes, something shifted. Messages began circulating, calls went unanswered, and a quiet tension replaced the usual rhythm. Those closest to the heart of the show sensed it first. The energy had changed. What audiences didn't yet know was that a private moment had cracked open, allowing real fear to seep through a world usually defined by brightness and control. A public love story with private boundaries. For decades, Mark Consuelos and Kelly Ripa have represented a rare balance between public affection and private protection. Their chemistry on screen has always been easy, playful, and genuine, but it coexisted with firm boundaries around what stayed off camera. They shared joy generously, but pain sparingly. That balance, carefully maintained over years, was about to be tested. Because when a crisis arrives, it doesn't ask whether you are ready or whether your life is lived in front of millions. It simply demands attention. The call that changed. Everything that morning began like so many others, filled with movement and small obligations that define a busy household. Calendars were checked, conversations overlapped, and plans moved forward automatically. Then the phone rang, the kind of call that alters the tone of a room instantly. The words were few but urgent. A condition that had been monitored carefully had worsened. Doctors were concerned. Family was advised to come immediately. Within minutes, schedules were abandoned. Kelly left without hesitation. The version of her the audience knows disappeared, replaced by a partner and mother focused solely on what mattered. Stepping away from the spotlight. When the cameras went dark, it wasn't an act of retreat but of priority. Kelly's absence was noticeable but intentional. In moments like these, public expectations lose relevance. The familiar glow of studio lights gave way to hospital corridors, and applause was replaced by the steady hum of medical equipment. The transition was abrupt but grounding. This was no longer about performance. It was about presence, and presence in its simplest form meant showing up and staying. The equalizing nature of hospitals strip away illusion. They are indifferent to status, unmoved by reputation. In waiting rooms and hallways, everyone speaks the same quiet language of hope and fear. That space became a crossroads where personal vulnerability met public curiosity. Family members arrived quietly. Friends checked in without asking for answers. Meanwhile, outside, questions grew louder. How does one protect intimacy when concern becomes news? How do you grieve or hope when every movement feels observed? Holding steady. Amid uncertainty, Kelly moved through the hospital with focus and restraint. She listened carefully, asked questions, and stayed close. Her gestures were small but profound. Sitting beside a bed, holding a hand, waiting without distraction. Time behaved strangely in those hours. Moments stretched endlessly, then collapsed suddenly. The future felt suspended. There were no conclusions, only updates. No clarity, only cautious explanations. And still she stayed, anchored by the belief that love expressed through presence is never wasted. Understanding the crisis without drama. What unfolded medically was serious but treated with professionalism and care. A condition once stable required heightened attention. Monitoring intensified. Specialists collaborated. The language used was careful, deliberate, and honest. Words like critical were not meant to alarm, but to describe vigilance. For the family, every update reshaped the emotional landscape. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in waves, receding and returning, demanding patience and resilience. The network that quietly mobilized. In times of crisis, support often arrives without announcement. Friends rearranged schedules. Colleagues stepped in without being asked. Messages of encouragement flowed steadily, not as noise, but as reassurance. What stood out was how quickly a professional ecosystem transformed into something deeply personal. Roles changed. Assistants became coordinators of care. Industry peers became sources of comfort. The machinery of celebrity paused, replaced by something far more human. The invisible heroes of care behind every headline-worthy story of illness are countless individuals whose work remains unseen. Nurses monitoring subtle changes, technicians adjusting equipment with precision, doctors conferring quietly, choosing words with care. Their efforts form the backbone of every recovery story, even when outcomes remain uncertain. For the family, learning this world meant learning trust. Trust in expertise, trust in process, trust that effort itself carries meaning even when certainty does not. Living between hope and waiting days passed measured not by clocks, but by updates. Small improvements were celebrated cautiously. Setbacks were met with resolve rather than despair. Hope became something carefully held, not announced, not exaggerated. The family learned to exist in the in-between space where nothing is guaranteed, yet everything feels possible. It was exhausting and grounding all at once. In that space, love did not need language. It simply needed consistency. The weight of being seen. Outside the hospital walls, attention persisted. Silence was interpreted. Absence became speculation, yet the family remained deliberate in what they shared. Privacy, once a preference, became a necessity. Not because the public lacked compassion, but because healing requires space. Even the most well-meaning concern can become overwhelming when multiplied by millions. Choosing restraint was not secrecy, it was survival. Redefining strength. Strength revealed itself in unexpected ways, not in dramatic declarations, but in endurance. In returning to the bedside after restless nights, in answering questions with patience, in accepting help without shame. Kelly's strength was not the kind displayed under studio lights. It was quieter, steadier, and far more demanding. It lived in the ability to hold fear without letting it define the moment. The power of small moments. Recovery, when it began to show itself, did so subtly. A stabilized reading, a calmer night, a conversation that lasted a little longer. These moments did not feel small to those experiencing them. They felt monumental. Each one served as a reminder that progress often whispers before it speaks. The family learned to recognize these signals and honor them without rushing ahead. A story still being written. This chapter of the story does not conclude with resolution, because real life rarely does. It exists instead as a portrait of vulnerability, devotion, and the delicate balance between public life and private endurance. What emerged was not a spectacle, but a reminder that behind every familiar face is a human life. That love, when tested, does not always roar. Sometimes it simply stays. What remains after the noise? When the moment eventually passes, what will linger is not the rumors or the headlines, but the quiet truth of what it meant to show up fully when it mattered most. This story is not about illness alone. It is about choosing presence over performance, care over commentary, and humanity over spectacle. And in that choice, there is something profoundly powerful.